A mature ego is one that can hold on to the good and the bad. And even though you can't live together, you can't be married to one another, you created children together. And the concept is that you try to hold on to the good of that person. It's not easy, but it's really critical because even though that divorce is happening between you and your ex-partner, it's not happening for that child. That child is not divorcing you, and you're not divorcing that child.
Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. This is where we have honest, thoughtful conversations about divorce, the emotional, financial, legal, and family questions no one prepares you for. From deciding whether to separate, to navigating the process with dignity, to rebuilding what comes next, Divorce Dialogues is here to help you find clarity, perspective, and a better way forward. Hello. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Dr. Erica Komisar. She's a psychoanalyst, a parenting expert, and the author of the upcoming book, The Parent's Guide to Divorce, Very Much Needed. Erica has spent decades working with children and families, and her current work focuses on separation and divorce and how it shapes a child's emotional world, often in ways that parents do not intend and don't ever even know. So today, we're going to be talking about how parents can navigate divorce with a greater awareness of their children's emotional security and how to make decisions that truly support the children's long-term well-being and not just short-term peace. Welcome, Dr. Erica Komisar. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I know that you work with children every day, and I'm sure that that's what drove you to write this book in the first place. And so what is it that, just at the outset of the show, what do you wish that divorcing parents really understood earlier about how divorce lands for kids emotionally?
Well, I think the old wisdom was that divorce is always bad for children. And we know differently now that when there is intractable conflict, unresolvable conflict, and children are faced with living in a home with parents who really don't like each other and can't hide it, then it's far better for children to live in two separate homes in a more peaceful situation. And then the impetus is on the parents to make it as amicable and peaceful as possible. But we know that most divorces are not amicable and peaceful. One of the main reasons why they're not is because it's very hard for parents not to bring their own pain to the situation, because a divorce is such a painful thing for the adults involved. They feel so rejected and abandoned, and it's very common that there's one person that initiates the process. And so essentially parents aren't even aware that they're sharing their pain with their children, when in fact that does a great deal of harm to children. That children need to, as much as possible, be protected from their parents' pain. Obviously that means that parents need to get enough support so they're not bringing that pain to the situation. I always say that if you stub your toe, like on the corner of your bed, that you're going to scream at whoever is in the room because you're in such pain. Meanwhile, it's not their fault. And that's just a natural result of being in pain. The main message of this book is, I really got intrigued with this idea of 50-50 custody and the custody arrangements around children, and that they were so non-child centric, that they were very much focused on children being like possessions.
Like a commodity, right?
Like a commodity, like a Porsche, like a vase. Yeah. In fact, treating it more like King Solomon, and the story of King Solomon and the two mothers and the baby, like split the baby in half. Right? Take a child, particularly the little ones under the age of 3. And I was being approached by a lot of parents, some of them whom were breastfeeding, where the baby was still securely attached to the mother, sleeping with the mother, and the baby was treated by the judges and the other parent, as you say, a commodity. And you split the baby like you split a muffin in half, 50-50. Yeah. And you take a breastfeeding baby away from a securely attached circumstance, and you give it 3 days a week to a father who's not had much contact with them and isn't the sensitive, empathic nurturer. So, and that could also apply in other ways if the father's the sensitive, empathic nurturer, or in adolescence, for instance, if a child at that point in their development needs the father more. And the mother holds on to that child and those 50-50 circumstances in a possessive way. So it's really looking at children's development in this process rather than just thinking of them as possessions to be split half and half.
Yeah, I think there really is, Erica, a tension sometimes between a real view of the child's needs and best interests at that particular time, or the children's. And when there's more than one child, there's also the complication of the relationship between them. And there's a real tendency and view that the best interests of the children are to be together all the time, which isn't necessarily true. And what do I know? I mean, I'm just a lawyer, right? But that's what I think. And then, what's fair to the parents? Like, I'm not going to be a lesser parent or that sort of thing. And I try to say to my clients that you're not a lesser parent because you have less time at this moment in time.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
It's also this idea that once the parenting plan goes into place, it's written in stone and it's never going to change. And honestly, that's true with regard to when judges say things, then you have to go back to court and make a whole thing about how I want to change it. It's the best interest of the children. It just seems like that's way too much effort and not so good for the kids. So I wonder, in your experience of working with parents who are flexible with each other about the needs of the children, the development of the children. Say you're talking about a 5-year-old, you got 13 years before that kid goes to college, more or less.
Yes.
That's a long road developmentally. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think I want to just pick up on the word fairness because that's an important word in divorces. Parents go into the process, again, thinking about what's fair for them, not what's fair for the children. And I think that goes back to the idea that parents' needs in the legal system are primary, not children's needs. And in fact, it should be children's needs that we should be paying attention to rather than parents' needs, because you do have many, many years to connect with and give to and love your children. One of the most loving things you can do as a parent is to recognize in a moment in development that that child needs to be with one parent or another more at that moment, and to release this idea of 50-50 and fairness and getting my due because it's all about me. And there's something very generous and giving about that children later recognize. And my favorite anecdote, if you will, the case that I love the most is a father who I worked with for many years who was divorcing, and he had 3 children and they were different developmental ages. And some of the children were fine coming over at their time to stay with him. And one of the children wasn't ready to leave the mother. And he said, that's okay. He said, I understand. When you're ready, I'm here. I love you. We can do day things. And when you want to join your siblings, you can. There was a very secure feeling father who wasn't threatened by the idea that he didn't have contact with his children physically every day. But again, he would come and visit them during the week. And the other thing that happened in that case, which I thought was really interesting, is that he took them for the weekends and the mother had them during the week because of that idea of stability. So what we don't think about is this 2-3-2 situation that ends up happening is treating children like they're a sack of potatoes. Okay, you catch the sack. Okay, I'll catch the sack. And the children are the losers because they're going back and forth and back. Children, particularly during the week when they're in school and they're very young, they need a lot of stability. And so allowing them to have Monday through Thursday or Monday through Friday at one home and then having the other home on weekends, there's something to that I really respected. And it all paid off for this father because in the end, his children admired him for not being possessive. And he ended up being very close with these children because he was able to pay attention to the social cues and the developmental needs of each of his children and not force on them some paradigm of it's about me and it's about fairness and it's about possession. I own you. We don't own our children. You know the Khalil Gibran poem about how children are just arrows from our bows. We don't own our children. They pass through us. We are the custodians of them. We don't own them. They aren't possessions.
I just have a couple of comments. I have 5 kids, as longtime listeners to the podcast will know,
Yeah.
And I have a blended family. And in my experience, one, that parenthood is a series of lettings go, right?
Yeah.
Like we, as mothers, we physically let go, like of them in childbirth, and then we let them develop and leave in hopefully in a somewhat protected way so that they can't be hurt too badly. But that requires a lot of discipline. So that's one. And I think that it's really the discipline is much harder when you're not going to have them with you all the time. That can feel requires even more discipline. That's one comment I have. And the other is, and this came up, Erica, when you said that something about this father in your situation really being rewarded for his efforts. And that isn't something I tell my clients sometimes, is that the majority of the relationship that we have with our children will be after they leave home.
That's right.
And if you don't really plan for that adult to adult relationship, they're not going to visit. They're
That's
not
right.
going to, right?
That's
And
right.
right. And that's where the
right.
reward is, right? In those years later, that you're preparing your children to be functioning, fabulous adults who want a relationship with their parents.
What I tell all the parents that I work with to do is, if they haven't come from a divorce background themselves, to ask to survey all of their friends who have been through divorces, adults who remember what it was like to be the child of divorce, and ask them about the worst mistakes that their parents made, and then avoid those mistakes. So one of the reasons I wrote this book is precisely that. I listened to my patients over the years and took note of all of the mistakes that those families made, and then educate people in this book about how to avoid those mistakes. Possession is one of them. Another is weaponizing your children or using your children as messengers. I mean, there's a whole list of things. But I think when you hear it from the horse's mouth, and again, some people have been through divorces in their childhood and they have amnesia. They forget when we're in pain, our memory isn't necessarily functioning in the same way. Our long-term memory isn't functioning. And so to be able to remember what your parents may have done poorly and to do better, isn't that what all of us want? And so if your parents were belligerent towards one another and weaponized you and spoke badly about each other to you, and these were painful things for you, put you in the middle, made you choose allegiances, shared too much of their pain and their personal situations with you. These are all things that my patients over the years have complained about and grieved about, and yet, when it comes to their own divorce situations, may not remember it and maybe need to be reminded of what are the most painful things that your parents, or let's say your friends' parents, have done that need correcting.
Divorce Dialogues is brought to you by Miller Law Group. We believe divorce isn't just a legal process, it's a human transition. At Miller Law Group, we help people navigate divorce with dignity, clarity, and respect, focusing on conversations that lead to better outcomes for families. Learn more at miller-law.com. About 10 years ago, I went on a survey of asking the adult children of divorced parents if they could go back in time and tell their parents something that they wished that they had done better and something that they thought they did well. Wherever I would go, if it happened to come up in conversation, the concierge at the Ritz-Carlton or the driver on the bus or whatever. And people would be like, oh, ask me, total strangers, because they really wanted to answer this question. So, and I wrote an article about it. It's on my website. But for parents who are listening to this and wondering, how can I tell the difference between my child adapting effectively or just shutting down? Like, how can I tell what it is? What is your answer to that?
What I would say is that you look for symptoms that last for at least 2 weeks chronically. If your child is just quiet and not talking to you, but has someone else to talk to. I mean, sometimes it's hard for children to talk to their parents about their feelings because some of those feelings will be about those parents and they feel either ashamed or guilty or uncomfortable or afraid, to be honest, depending on how parents cope with things like angry feelings or sad feelings. So if you are a parent who is open to hearing and think of feelings as on a spectrum and all feelings are okay, and you make it very clear that you are open to all feelings, then your children will share with you. But if you're someone who is very repressed or come from a very repressed background or are not comfortable with anger or extreme sadness, then your children aren't going to bring it to you. I mean, they can feel how comfortable you are, but because they're not necessarily bringing it to you, you need to make sure that they have the opportunity to bring it to someone else. I always say when kids are going through divorce, it's always better for them to have a therapist because they do feel often conflicted about sharing feelings with parents, and particularly sharing feelings about the other parent. So, because they're afraid that it will cause conflict between the parents, or there's already conflict and they don't want to exacerbate it. So it's very important to have a therapist if you can find one. And I know for some people it feels unaffordable or not accessible. Now with online therapy, it's more accessible and more affordable. So I'm going to say that's the good thing that came
Yeah.
out of COVID. But it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that because they're not communicating with you, there's something wrong. As long as they have someone else to communicate with, I would look for other kind of symptoms. I would look for social withdrawal. I would look for mood shifts, dramatic mood shifts. I would look for eating or sleeping changes. I would look for a drop or a change in their school performance. But the biggest one, believe it or not, I would look for is social withdrawal. That's a big one in terms of looking for depression.
While we're on this related topic, let's talk a little bit about splitting, because oftentimes people will report, well, Johnny tells me he wants to spend more time with me. Well, Johnny tells me he hates spending time with you and he wants to spend more time with me. And I think both these things are true. So
Right.
could you talk about that phenomenon and why that happens and what parents can do about that?
Well, as you say, both can be true at the same time. And also, children will tell parents what they want to hear because they're afraid of telling parents what they really feel. And this is where I'm going to say again, I hate to be like a pitcher of therapy. I mean, I don't mean to be, but
I agree with you, though, by the way.
but I will say that having a good child therapist or adolescent therapist, the person's neutral. They're like, they can be more neutral. And every good child therapist does parent guidance as well, at least once a month if they're under adolescents. And if they're adolescents and it's a very difficult divorce, you can still ask to do some parent guidance with the therapist once a month per se. And I think that that's a good thing because you get to hear from the therapist what that therapist believes is the best thing for that child at that moment. The therapist will say, your son is really needing a little bit more time with his mom, and I think he's afraid to tell you. So it's the person who can say the things that are hard to say. So children aren't always the best messengers because they're afraid of hurting their parents, or they want to please their parents, or they're afraid to upset their parents. So they will tell their parents different things at different times. And you also have to wonder whether the parents are hearing it properly, whether they're hearing it through their own particular lens of what they want to hear, whether they manipulate it out of the children to get them to say what they want to hear. So having that third person in there, that neutral party who's really there for the child and is not on either side of the parents, is really helpful in determining what that child needs at that moment.
A lot of my clients say that their children are resistant or reluctant or straight out refuse to go see a therapist. And so what advice do you have for those people?
Sometimes you have to wait for the symptoms. It's like waiting for the pot to boil. When you're waiting for your tea, you have to wait until the water gets to a certain temperature. And not inevitably, but almost inevitably, divorce will cause some symptoms. And when the symptoms show, don't ignore them. Don't turn away from them. Don't justify not doing something. Use it as an opportunity in that moment to jump on getting them someone to talk to. So you look for the symptoms and then you follow through with getting them help based on those symptoms. So, we all have defenses that help us to function, and children have, very young children in particular have very good defenses, which is why you can go to a funeral and not see a child cry, or why you can go through a divorce situation and the children seem like, oh, it's okay, mom, I'm fine. I'm going to have two homes. But in the end, the defenses eventually break down. And so you're sort of, I hate to sounds terrible what I'm saying, but it's true. You're sort of waiting for the wall to crumble. And then when you start to, if they're resistant, if they're not resistant, get them into therapy preventatively. But if they are, then wait to see signs that their defenses are the walls are starting to come down, and then get them help.
A lot of people And I think you mentioned this at the beginning of the show where people stay together for the children. Or that's
Yeah.
not your words, but I think that's what you meant. But I think a lot of parents feel guilty for the disruption and the pain that they're putting their kids through.
Mhm.
So, for those parents who are feeling overwhelmed or guilty, what do you want them to remember about repair and resilience for their kids?
Well, again, it goes back to that old Judith Wallerstein book, which told, I think it was the 80s, which told all parents that all divorces were bad for children. The truth of the matter is that there are consequences of getting divorced with children. But if you're looking comparatively at what are the consequences of a good divorce, a child healthy divorce, versus staying with someone who you hate and you're in conflict with constantly, the outcomes are much better if you can have a cooperative, healthy co-parenting situation than if you stay in a bad marriage. And that's what the research shows, that a good divorce is better than a bad marriage for children, but that doesn't mean that it's without consequences. In other words, either one is going to have consequences. If you stay in a bad marriage, it is also going to have consequences. So I think we don't talk about how children living in intractable conflict also has consequences.
Yeah, really wise words. And I think that Wallerstein took back a lot of her advice in that
She
book
did.
later in her life.
She did. And the research since showed that this idea of intractable conflict really does a lot of harm to children. But again, I don't want to make it all rainbows and unicorns.
No,
Divorces
it's
are
hard work.
It's
Yeah.
hard work. It's hard on children. It's hard on parents. But if you do it well, it mitigates and reduces a lot of the negative impact of it.
We're almost out of time, but I have a couple more questions before we do. And the first one is, if there's one belief that parents need to reframe during divorce in order to protect their children, what is it?
I guess the one belief is that 50-50 never means equal time in a divorce. And if you can let that go and think of what's best for the child in the moment developmentally, you're doing a great service and you're giving your children a great gift, and those children will remember it forevermore.
That's great. And the last question is, if there's a parent going through divorce listening today, if they remember only one thing from this conversation, what would you want them to carry with them?
To remember that even though we use the word amicable, it's really not paying lip service to amicable. It's a very hard thing to go through a divorce where you maintain your kindness, you maintain your humanity, you maintain your empathy. It's a very hard thing, but we know how secure a person is depending on how they can hold on to those characteristics. So what I would say is, you loved this person once that you're going through this divorce with, and you have to hold on to, in life, we know that a mature ego is one that can hold on to the good and the bad. And even though you can't live together, you can't be married to one another, you created children together. And the concept is that you try to hold on to the good of that person. It's not easy, but it's really critical, because even though that divorce is happening between you and your ex-partner, it's not happening for that child. That child is not divorcing you, and you're not divorcing that child. And so that child still has preferably a mother and a father, two parents. And so they have to hold on to the love for each of those parents, and you have to let them hold on to the love for each of those parents.
That's great. Dr. Erica Komisar, let our listeners know where they can learn about and find the book and where they can contact you.
So you can reach me at www.komisar, KOMISAR.com, and you can see all the things that I do, and you can make an appointment, and there's links to buying my books. You can also buy the book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
That's great. And all of those links will be in the show notes as well. Thank you again. Great conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
If this conversation was helpful, share it with someone who might need it. And if you're navigating divorce yourself, you'll find more resources and episodes at miller-law.com. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.